Polsley. She has a heart for our Central Committee, the Republican Party, and loves our country. When I asked her for a description for her presentation, this is what she gave me. Behind every political agenda lies an ideology and a vision for the future. How and why is justice being used as a key leftist talking point to unify all aspects of society under a socialist umbrella? A spinal cord injury survivor and blogger, she is author of the science fiction series Ifscapes and manager, co-founder of the tech startup Portical LC. Welcome, Cara.
Thank you. It's a privilege for me. What you have coming around to you is a handout that actually encapsulates much of the material that's on the slides today. And it is a short survey, but we'll be looking at a lot of text to give you an example of some of the topics that we'll be discussing. So some of them will be on your handout as well, just for helpful reference, I hope. Let me start out by saying that none of this talk is focusing on an institution, an organization, an individual. When we say ideology, I am strictly referring to a set of principles, values, and moral frameworks that we'll see echoed in a lot of the things that we'll be looking at tonight. So I'm not trying to look at any one person, any one group, and focus on that one group, that one person, and say, yes, they're responsible for, say, destroying the world. I'm looking at the ideology and what they're propagating. And as we'll see with many of the texts we'll be seeing tonight, there's a very consistent framework and set of values that is being shared by many of the same groups. And many of them would tell you that it's an oversimplification, perhaps, of what they believe. But if you look at what they are saying in the context of what they say, this is what is emergent. So I'll start with that caveat. The description of today's talk, when I say that behind every political viewpoint there's an ideology, that might seem a little bit startling to think of politics as something that has a set of values and morals behind it. But that's actually something that's behind really everything we do as individuals. There's an ideology behind everything we do, because what you do and what you think and the actions that result are connected to what you believe about the past, the present, the future. And as we'll see, the ideologies that are involved today in describing justice have to do with exactly that, a vision of a future world and what that world is going to look like. And one of the most prominent examples of ideology in action, especially today, is justice. Now, before we talk about any value or anything, we should talk about what justice actually is. Because what I'll be talking about tonight is what I'll call the modern, redefined social justice. It's a very loaded term, as we'll be seeing, but it's different from classical justice. So what is classical justice? What does it mean to discuss justice in the first place? Well, here is the description that is what is classically celebrated in Western tradition, and which the founding fathers, for instance, would have had in mind in writing the Constitution. And this is a Latin phrase coming from the works of the Roman author Cicero, who watered it down into this really concise phrase. It's suum cuique, meaning to each his own. And there are some underlying assumptions behind what he meant. Go to the next one, please. And here are just a few of those. So here are assumptions of classical justice. The founding fathers, Western civilization, this is what they had in mind. First of all, that humans were divinely given a distinct nature, so meaning that there actually is something that is responsible for the human nature as it is. A higher power gave humans the idea of justice. So the assumption is we don't make justice up on our own. It's not something that we decide or just feel good about and say, oh, let's have this idea of something that would be a law governing people. Another assumption is that human nature doesn't change. And this will be really important for a lot of the modern views of justice. This is a big contrast, because to the founding fathers, human nature was something so consistent that when they wrote the Constitution, they said, we need to keep this in place because human nature won't get better. It's not going to evolve or develop. But modern justice argues that it does, as we'll see tonight. The need for equal opportunities as an assumption of classical justice, that you begin at the equalized platform, but you don't necessarily have these same outcomes. That will be a strong contrast. A need for outcomes that are based on merit. So classical justice doesn't assume that you receive a certain outcome just because of who you are. Your identity, your label, your name, your background don't entitle you to some certain outcome as an individual. Classically, your outcome is based on your merit, your abilities and how you use them, how you exercise your responsibilities, and then your work ethic, values like that. And then the truth does not change. Now that's a big sticking point with modern culture today. But classically speaking, Western tradition regarded truth as something that was absolute. And that was a critical point for constructing the Constitution too. Because when they came up with the Constitution, they said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And they end it with a period because they don't want anyone going back and saying, yes, and this and this and this and this and this, and just adding to it willy-nilly. That's why they put such a framework in place for our Constitution even to be changed, is because they recognized these values. But there are other sides of the coin too. Here's modern or redefined, as I call it, justice. And I'm calling it modern. This is not a new idea. It goes way back. But it's very modern in that now this is, if you hear justice on the TV, in the political sphere, this is what really is being discussed. And if you look for some of the buzzwords we'll be seeing tonight, you can start to recognize that as a filter a little bit when you hear the word justice. So most of the time it's referred to as justice. The UN, as we'll see, actually calls it social justice or justice. And here's a quote from the UN Open Forum on social justice, actually. Justice derives from equality of rights for all people and the possibility for all human beings without discrimination to benefit from the economic and social progress disseminated and secured through international cooperation. Now, much of that sounds very good. We think of equality, without discrimination, to benefit, but there's a lot between the lines here that if you look at this definition, it's actually quite loaded. And another aspect of that is that when they're saying words like equality, we have to be looking and seeing, does that match up with what we see with, say, classical equality? When the Founding Fathers talked about equality, were they talking about the same thing as the UN? So we must bear those things in mind when we see anything like this phrase. But let's look a little bit at the assumptions behind a discussion like this. Yes, please. First, here are a few assumptions. First, need for equal outcomes, not opportunities. That is a huge difference. And that is one of the primary things behind the call for social justice today. So if you pay attention to what is being taught to, say, children in schools, they're being taught that people need the same equal outcomes, not necessarily the same equal opportunities. Remember the UN said everyone needs the ability to benefit from dissemination, from distribution. So your outcome is given to you, it's distributed from somebody else. Now that somebody else is the second assumption, the need for an elite globalized regulation. This would be a system that is able to determine and oversee who gets what outcomes. Because it's one thing to say everyone should get the same, but who actually gets to determine that? A need for a break with the past. That actually is quite essential too, because if there are people like us who are conservatives going around and saying, no, in the past, socialism didn't work, then that doesn't turn out too well for people making the argument it does. Also, we're sticklers for the past because we say the Constitution is not a changing document that you can apply differently from day to day. And things like that are troublesome. You know, they're troublesome to an agenda where you're trying to teach that things are evolving to get better. And that will come in to this much as well. A need for a new social contract. Social contract, you remember from American government, it's one of those terms you hear that you're taught was one of the beginning points of the American Constitution itself. So an alliance that's formed between the people with an equal law to be applied equally. But the new social contract we'll be seeing tonight is a very different sort of social contract. But we'll be seeing that in a lot of really important documents. And it's basically a code word for a changing government system, a new alliance that supersedes the old ones. Equal voice, and that, as part of the syllogism, would equal democratic socialism. We'll be talking about how America is supposedly a democracy now tonight, and talking about how that's actually not true. But this is a way that modern justice gets around the issues of having a constitution, so they claim that an equal voice means that you have an equal right to socialism. And then the last one, that truth evolves. So remember, classical justice says that truth is absolute and it's unchanging, but in this view, truth evolves, so does human nature, so does the nature of, say, justice, so does everything else. And justice is one of the talking points for all of this, because if you frame all of this as justice and someone disagrees with you, then all you have to say is, well, don't you care about people? You're unjust. You don't care about the law? You hate people, don't you? And it goes downhill pretty quickly from there. Before going on, one last thing to note with these assumptions. This whole point about break with the past, new social contract, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in politics today, picking on conservatives and saying you're nationalists. And you notice very often now, they don't say patriots, they say nationalists. But we have to realize all of this forceful collection of resources that's going to be redistributed, which is the socialist view and that's associated with all of this, it doesn't actually get rid of socialism or nationalism. It actually has the idea that there's a higher nationalism. So people who propagate this, they're not necessarily saying they're not nationalists, they're saying the globe is my nation. You are a world citizen, therefore, if you are a just person and you care about the community around you, you have the obligation to care for the globe as your nation too. So by calling us nationalists, they can say, well, you know, and not patriots. Patriots defend your country when it's doing what's right, nationalists when it's doing what's right or wrong. And they can frame everyone on the same level, say we're all nationalists. But then, because we all live on the same planet, you have the obligation to be a global nationalist too. So something to be considering. Yes, please. Okay, so where does that take us? Well, justice today is framed very heavily with a lot of buzzwords that you see across the media, across politics, schools, churches. These are only a few examples that I've pulled out for you. There are some of them listed on your handout as well, but just to give you an idea of some of them. Resilience, sustainability, clean energy, responsibility, all of these things that you hear that they sound like good moral values, right? Who doesn't want to be decent? If you hear somebody say, I'm building a responsible world, and you say, well, I don't want that, that actually comes off as you looking bad. So it's a very clever way to frame justice and all of these ideals. Poverty, green energy, that's a big one. Restoration, that we're restoring rights to the people. And by the way, you're the people. So if you're going to be a person who's doing what you should be, if you care about humanity, then you'll care about all these things too. But remember, these things sound good, but they're loaded. They aren't necessarily what they used to mean, because they believe truth evolves, and they aren't necessarily what you think they mean, because you may be a confused person who doesn't know what's good for, well, you and everyone else around you. Okay, so, yes, please. Justice itself, though, is not just a buzzword for the people who use it as a talking point. It's actually being used for a certain course of action. And to give you an example of that, I just pulled out one of the groups that is rising to, I think, rising to a lot of knowledge among conservatives today. They've actually been around since 1971 under a different name, but it's only recently that a lot of people are beginning to talk about what's called the Great Reset. Well, here it is. This is by the World Economic Forum. I'll read it in just a minute. They meet every January in Switzerland, and they talk about issues related to social justice, to building a more just, common good sort of world. They made the news really last year because a lot of the conservative sites started hearing talk about the Great Reset, which was supposed to be really unveiled in 2021, right after the election period. But they've actually had this out for quite some time. They have a very detailed website that is full of a lot of buzzwords, so if you go there, be aware of that. But this is a group of a lot of bankers, leaders, social influencers, and as I said, it's been around for quite a while. And this is what they say they are going to do with the Great Reset. They say it's a commitment to jointly and urgently build the foundations of our economic and social system for a more fair, sustainable, and resilient future. It requires a new social contract centered on human dignity, social justice, and where societal progress does not fall behind economic development. Well, that has a lot of broad concepts in it, but what does it actually mean? Well, let's take a look at some of the elements of their plan in more detail, because let's see what justice has to do with any of this. They talk about just, social contract, all of that. What does that even mean? Well, their idea of social justice in action has three main elements. They're going to steer the market toward fair outcomes, upgrade trade arrangements, and create the conditions for a stakeholder economy, which basically is a connection of big government to the people, where we are, we have a regulation system over us with a social metric. And they're going to implement reforms that promote more equitable outcomes. Number two, ensure that investments advance shared goals, so this idea of the common good, such as equality and sustainability. And number three, harness the innovations of the fourth industrial revolution to support the public good. The fourth industrial revolution is described on the WEF website as the next big jump in technology and the big innovations that are coming. So basically, what they're saying here is we're going to have an overhaul of institutions of every level and every kind, with an emphasis on common goals and an overarching connection between government officials, big business leaders, and specialists. The United Nations had a similar set of goals that they released in 2015. There are 17 of these sustainable development goals. They also are full of the buzzwords that we've talked about. And if you read between the lines, the words they use all have more loaded meanings that are linked exactly to the things we have already been talking about. That what they'll do is gather resources worldwide, internationally, decide who has what need, and then they will distribute it accordingly. So remember, in elite regulation that oversaw everything else, a changing sense of justice, so it depends on the circumstances, the time frame, who you are. They have the ideas like social scoring, paying attention to who you are personally. So all those ideas that we've seen in the modern idea of justice are thick throughout things like these goals. So here they are, the SDGs. If you want a perfect world, here you go, this is what you must want. Number one, being no poverty. 2, zero hunger. 3, good health and well-being. 4, equality education. 5, gender equality. 6, clean water and sanitation. 7, affordable and clean energy. 8, decent work and economic growth. 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. 10, reduced inequalities. You can see much of what we've already talked about behind many of these words that we're already seeing up here, and it is indeed the same system that is being told that we need to accomplish those things. But that's not it. If you go, that's not all, I should say. If you go through the SDGs, there are more than 10, there are 17, and here are the last few. Sustainable cities and communities, so this would be on the level we live on, not just up in some international port. Responsible consumption and production, that means you, that means me, that means what we buy and what we use. 13, climate action, which would have to do with regulations again on what we buy, what we use, what we wear. 14, life below water, just in case you thought you'd escaped to Atlantis or something. 15, life on land. 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And 17, partnerships for the goals. Very, very comprehensive, but what's the timeline for all this? Well, if you live 10 more years, you too can take part in this wonderful, perfect society, because the UN says, in order to leave no one behind, meaning all of us, it is important that we achieve them all by 2030. That's moving very fast. That involves a lot of necessary changes very quickly. But, you know, I guess if you're hungry, don't worry about it. If you wait 10 years, hunger is taken care of. And if you feel like you're poor, don't worry about it. Just hang on 10 years and you're going to be okay. Already taken care of. But it isn't just the UN and social influencers in Switzerland talking about this. It's also one of our favorite groups. Oh, I skipped one, didn't I? All right, well, let's talk about this one first. So, accelerating social justice, talk about how we're moving so quickly. I won't read all these quotes when they're up. But here's what the UN says. We will work to create an unstoppable force linked to the global goals. This requires each of us to take action individually and collectively, locally and globally. We must be the generation to end extreme poverty, win the race against climate change, and conquer injustice and gender inequality. And the 2030 Agenda is our roadmap for the world we all want. Remember, good global citizens, we all want it, right? Because that's what justice means. Okay, now we can go to one of our favorite groups here. I think it's the next slide. Yes, in step with this agenda, the 2020 Democratic Party platform. Now I'll just tell you, if ours is 5 pages, if you read this document, it is much longer than 5 pages. It is very full of buzzwords, and it's very, very in line with what we've already been seeing before. So as much as you hear talk about individuality and America first, this is what is actually in the platform recorded. Democrats will form a new social and economic contract with the American people. We've seen that before already. Democrats commit to reducing climate risks and building back better after disasters and climate-fueled catastrophes in a resilient, green, and just manner, according to the justice that we've already been seeing. And in line with that, even build back better, I didn't put that as a buzzword, but that slogan historically was used for a lot of infrastructure needs, like after earthquakes, especially in Japan. But here, in this context, and in the context that it's being used today, it's being used in response to COVID. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't noticed COVID making any bridges get sick and fall down. The potholes in our roads right outside are not due to the coronavirus, at least not immediately, or they'd be wearing masks too. But, you know, the point is, building back better here is an infrastructure of society, turning everything in the world into a just outcome world, redistributed justice. Okay. And then one of my favorites, Democrats believe we must embed environmental justice, economic justice, and climate justice at the heart of our policy and governing agenda. Now, in context of what we've been seeing, very loaded stuff here. And that's throughout the Democratic platform, but certainly worth being aware of. Again, this is not a new thing. This isn't a new narrative. Social justice is a very, very old concept. And for that reason, I want to show you one of the older examples, please, dating all the way back to 1898. Now compare what we've seen before with this, the platform of the Social Democratic Party of America. The Social Democratic Party of America believes its object to be the establishment of a system of cooperative production and distribution through the restoration to the people of all means of production and distribution, to be administered by organized society in the interest of the whole people and the complete emancipation of society from the domination of capitalism. This could have been written today because it fits exactly with what we have just been seeing, and that dates back to 1898. And by the way, that's from a group that merged with the Socialist Party around that same time. And this is something else they said. Social democracy is but another term for democratic socialism. So they were pretty open about it, that they were equating democracy on some level with socialism. And we'll be seeing that that's problematic itself. But as you can see, that's a very blunt way of saying that if you're going to be an equal society, that you need to be socialist, or else you're just not a just person. Because that's the narrative woven throughout the framework of all of these things. So occasionally different buzzwords, but we've already seen other groups and their goals show a really demonstrated devotion to the same cause, this distribution, gathering, control in the name of justice. So before going on, let's make a really important point about democracy and justice, please. Namely, that America is not actually a democracy. There we go. Benjamin Franklin, when he was asked what the government actually was going to be, said, it's a republic if you can keep it. That's a big if. and it's one we need to be keeping in mind because you can't easily go back. But so, what is the thing about a democracy and a constitutional republic? Because America has a constitutional republic, so when did it start becoming a democracy? Well, over time, one of the buzzwords that you started hearing was that America was democratic and that its government was democracy to give everybody an equal voice. But if you study government very much, then you find out quickly that a democracy is equal representation for everyone, yeah. But it also easily leads to mob rule. It easily leads to quick changes and fickle people, and so your government can change. Bang, 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 bang. That was one of the problems they had with it in ancient Athens, and it's the reason that our founding fathers looked at it and said, that's too dangerous. We need something that actually lasts and is more permanent and responsible than that. So the constitutional republic we have has a check and balance system in place, our three branches of government. We have things like the filibuster, electoral college, exactly for that reason. Those are checks and balances that the social justice crowd right now is saying have to go. But what's the point in calling America a democracy? Why? That's why I bring this one equation. Sorry, let me go back one. Well, okay, it's fine. That's my fault. If justice equals socialism, and socialism is democratic, then to be good people, to be democratic, America must become a socialist society. Because that is our inheritance as a democracy. That's playing with words a lot, but we've already been seeing a lot of that happen. And you can see how easily that automatically starts putting you in line to accepting what the socialist redefinition should be. So there's a good why. Let's talk about how. Okay. Actually, we're one off.
Okay.
All right, I'm sorry. How did I'll call it socialist, justice with redistribution of wealth to everybody become so important? Why is it a rallying cry? Well, here are a few reasons that we can find. First, social influencers across society and every sector. Confusion of the people, that is especially important if you have people who do not want to be educated, do not want to be paying attention, and they don't want to have to do with politics, so they just want to go home and be left alone. Which is reasonable, but at the same time, in a constitutional republic, we're all supposed to be involved because we have a share. We elect representatives who are supposed to represent us, and we're supposed to hold them accountable. Educational reforms, we'll look at those in a minute. Deliberate deception, so actually actively misleading people. And redefined American values, like justice. Okay. Let's look at a few of these then in practice. So one key reason for social influence is that many ministers, pastors, educators were signing things like this way back in the 1930s, so going back almost 100 years. This is a document called the Humanist Manifesto #1. There are 3 of them. They are publicly available. 1933, a socialized and cooperative economic order must be established to the end for the equitable distribution of the means of life be possible. Humanists demand a shared life in a shared world. Many of the people who signed this were people who were in conservative positions of power as well. So pastors, there are many, many educators associated with these documents. Let's go ahead and look at the next quote then from the Humanist Manifesto #2. This also, people putting social justice into practice, being inspired to do it, this is what they wrote about. 1973. Promises of immortal salvation or fear of eternal damnation are both illusory and harmful. They distract humans from present concerns, from self-actualization, and from rectifying social injustices. So you can see how quickly this is in every single aspect of society. And if you believe this in 1973, then it's your duty to be working to influence society the opposite way. Let's look at one more. The Humanist Manifesto from 2003. The language reads very similarly to 1933, 1973. The joining of individuality with interdependence enriches our lives. So interdependence meaning a big socialist society, everyone's connected. Common good is what matters. The individuality, you as an individual, are subsumed by a bigger structure. So what you want as a person matters, but it has to come secondary to the common good. And if you're confused, we have to train you to understand what is good for you. So that encourages us to enrich the lives of others and inspires hope of attaining peace, justice, and opportunity for all. and my PowerPoint ran these quotes together, but we seek to minimize the inequities of circumstance and ability, and we support a just distribution of nature's resources and the fruits of human effort so that as many as possible can enjoy a good life. A lot of buzzwords, a lot of loaded inference in that. Redistribution, taking all people's stuff, redistributing it according to something different, in oversight. And then that leads us one step further then. Who are the people signing these things? Because I said they were social influencers. Who are they? Let's take a look. One is John Dewey, the father of progressive education. If you know the public school system, he is quite responsible for what it looks like today. And after him, justice became one of the huge bywords of the education system. Justice in the frame of the Humanist Manifesto and in other documents, as we have already seen. Another is the president of Planned Parenthood, Alan Guttmacher. Maxine Green, a professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, who said that if the people ever come to believe that we should equalize outcomes, then we'll have to do basically a complete overhaul of all systems. And she too said justice needs to be the primary thing that we're teaching kids. But again, she was involved with the Humanist Manifesto, so it's that loaded justice. Let's take a look at one more. Roy Wood Sellers, who wrote The Next Step in Democracy, which was a very loaded book in itself, and here's one of the quotes from that book. Socialism is a democratic movement whose purpose is the securing of an economic reorganization of society which will give the maximum possible of justice, liberty, and efficiency. So again, all this stuff about reorganizing, distributing, gathering, and then this underlying assumption, America is now a democracy. He wasn't the only one. Many of you know the name Saul Alinsky. I'm stepping over to more the deliberate deception side now. This man wrote 2 treatises that are especially well known, Rules for Radicals and Reveille for Radicals. He's a hero to many on the left today. And he showed up a lot in Hillary Clinton's election because one of the conservatives dared mention his name. And so they went and looked him up and said, oh, no, he wasn't really that radical. Well, so here are a few quotes from him. He had a lot of instructions on how to change society. And one of the key parts of changing society was incorporating what he called the rules of the ethics of ends and means. I'm going to summarize that for you. The ends justify the means. But that's basically what he said. But here are 2 of the rules that have to do really specifically with what we're talking about tonight, with having this idea of justice that's cloaked. Rule 10, do what you can with what you have and clothe it with moral garments. Make it look good. Literally. Goals must be phrased in general terms like liberty, equality, fraternity, of the common welfare, pursuit of happiness, or bread and peace. Because Saul Alinsky recognized no one's going to come to your side if you say, come here, we're going to take all your stuff away from you, you won't get to decide anything about it, and everyone who works will get the same as everyone who doesn't work, and there's no incentive to do anything, so come to our side. We'll make you happy that way. That doesn't really fly very well. And Alinsky realized that. He's actually the father of community organizing, if you look him up online. And this is just a taste of some of the things he said. But he's very responsible for inspiring many of the people on the self-proclaimed progressive side today. So it's definitely worth looking at what he says. Okay, well, let's go to our next slide then. So this takes us back to the future then, because we're looking at all these characters who help influence things, they help deceive, they help bring things about to the way they are. Some of them could, some of them are altruists. Some of the people you meet who believe in this stuff are the nicest people you'll ever meet, and they'll give you the shirt off their backs, they'll give you their umbrella if it's pouring rain. Some people genuinely do believe this. And we have to understand, a lot of them have been taught it from childhood. We also have to understand that things like this come out of a background where people are being taught this is what justice now means. But talking about deception, social influence, we can't overlook what's happening on an international level. And remember, we're not talking about the people like Saul Alinsky, we're talking about the idea, the ideology, the Alinskyan rules in action, right? So here's what the UN says about justice. Back in 2006, this sounds much like what we've been seeing from 1933, 1973, all these things. You see the thread that goes throughout all of them. Social justice, they say, is treated as synonymous with distributive justice, which again is often identified with unqualified references to justice in the specific context of the activities of the United Nations. So Saul Alinsky said, take what you have and clothe it with moral garments. Well, just suggesting, when you see language like this, that filter should be working in our brains. Well, maybe. For the UN, justice equals distributive justice equals social justice. And that bears out in their documents very well as you read what they say about justice. So for an example, in the same document, the essence of democracy resides in a shared understanding of self-interest, enlightened self-interest, general interest, and the common good. There seems to be a need to revive the notion of a social contract both within communities and for the world as a whole, keeping in mind that whole thing we just saw with social justice equals justice. All of this for the UN, for what we've been seeing in all of these things, this new social contract, equality, equal voice, you see how well it all ties together under the umbrella of this is what justice now looks like. And this is what's being taught to our children and all the people who are just watching TV and looking at entertainment today. This is in our movies. This is in everything. This is the way justice is being presented. If you're just, you have to believe in these things, or you're not just anymore. So let's revisit the assumptions of modern justice then, just as we're concluding here. We saw equal outcomes, globalized regulation, breaking with the past, new social contract, democratic socialism, and the evolution of truth. Okay, let's see how these, please, have to do with some of the things then that we've seen in the documents we've been looking at for 100 years, 1898. Equal outcomes, we've seen redistributive resources, that they want to take everything in and then hand it out according to what this oversight says, so high-level controls to accomplish what I'm calling these buzzword goals. So climate change, sustainability, resilience, green energy, all those things. It's not that those things themselves are always inherently bad, but they're loaded. And that's true of everything, from green energy to justice itself, as we've seen. The break with the past, so any erasure or revision of history. How many of you watched statues being torn down last year and wondered about why? This is cancel culture. We'll just can't have what used to be. A new social contract that we cancel national sovereignty, remember, in favor of a global nation. Oppressing individuality and personal liberty in the name of democracy. So you're an individual, but you're an individual insofar as exercising your potential has to do with the common good. And we'll tell you what that looks like. And then the last one, truth evolves, that rulers end up dictating values. That they're not things that come from a higher power, any absolute truth anywhere, that everything changes. And so we need an evolving system that can tell us what justice looks like at any given moment. And the Humanist Manifesto is actually really big on the idea of evolving towards better humanity, and that people are getting better as time passes. There is one thing then, please, that I thought was worth returning to. Because when we speak about these sorts of descriptions, we need to be thinking about not only how we got here and what they look like, but also what can we do. And one of the biggest things we can do is realize what exactly is at stake with everything that is happening. Because it's so easy to be frustrated and bury our heads in the sands and say, look what happened in 2020, look what happened in 2019. But we need to be imparting to people how important it is that we stand strong on the things that we do. Alexis de Tocqueville, who actually wrote a very impressive book on America, and he said our morality and absolute values were what set us apart. He commented on the French Revolution in this dialogue called On Socialism. And even though he's talking about democracy here, it's worth looking at what he says about socialism and keeping it in mind, because he draws up the contrast and he puts it in really stark terms. He says socialism confines personal independence. Socialism makes of each man an agent, an instrument, a number. Democracy and socialism have only one thing in common, and that's equality, but note well the difference. Democracy aims at equality and liberty. Socialism desires equality in constraint and in servitude. Those are really big words, but we've seen a lot tonight with how much of that ties together with the idea of repressing individuality and redistributing and taking what you get, and that's what justice now looks like. So we're talking about, understand what's at stake. Just wrapping up, what can we do? Well, first of all, we've taken a huge step, even as we're recognizing things like cancel culture as a term, because that's something that for a long time conservatives didn't do. For a long time, we've been letting the leftists control the narrative and redefine things like social justice, while coming up with social justice and replacing the term justice. We've let them do that a lot. And we need to be recognizing that justice is used as a cloak. It's not us saying that, it's Saul Alinsky saying that. Saul Alinsky would not agree with us. Just, if you were worried or thought he might, he wouldn't. So one of the things we need to do is be educating ourselves and recognizing that this term social justice is loaded. We can go to their own documents and see what it stands for. We're not making it up. We need to recognize the buzzwords that are going throughout these things, and we need to apply that as a filter when we're watching TV, when we're talking with family, when we're hearing what our children are being educated about. Educated, I don't use air quotes, but if I did, I would, because that's actually what is happening in a lot of places with terms like justice. And then it's really important, too, that we return to and preserve what our founding fathers were reading. So I've shown you these things. They're from the past. We need to be also looking at what was in the past from the founding fathers personally, and we need to be reading those documents, which is why it's so important we read our state constitution, our national constitution, and that we look at these things and say, that's what we have to have applying as law to our country, and that we stand fast on that. And we have to be reading and educating, or else we aren't helpful at all in this whole situation. So is there a way forward when ideology like this is so strong? Because let's return to the very beginning, and I talked about ideology at the beginning, a set of values, principles, morals. What can we do when their ideological viewpoint is so strong? And it's pushed so far and so fast, and it infects our children. The most critical thing probably is to realize how they did it. What we've seen here is that they were very persistent, and they clung to that through education, through redefinition, and through sheer willpower. Now, I'm not saying we redefine, I'm saying let's return to the real definitions. Let's look at what they stood for when they were originally being used in the Constitution, and let's go back to that. The world's not going to easily do it with us, but it didn't easily change for them either. They were very, very stubborn, and it worked. And so we need to be equally persistent in seeking to do what is right and holding strong to those values. And we shouldn't just bury our head in sand and say, well, it can get better and it will just automatically change. We need to be doing our best to make a difference too. That's something I think we're all aware of, and it leaves us with the big, how do we do that? But the best way is probably reviewing what they themselves said. So I'll just end on that note today, and say, otherwise, if you want a perfect world, be looking at 2030, because that's apparently what you're aiming for. And Marty, I'll hand off to you unless there are any questions.